So we want to give you a little bit of scale and background about the sort of intensity and the unprecedented nature of the bombing campaign that has happened and continues to happen, thankfully to a lesser degree now, in Gaza. So this slide is a comparison between Aleppo, which was bombed extensively between 2013 and 2016, and this is al-Assad and the Russians bombing rebels in Aleppo. And that was over a 3-year period. They were only able to get satellite imagery from, this is the Washington Post, I believe, from November 26th. So again, that's, how many months ago did we decide? 4 months ago, is that right? And this is concentrated on northern Gaza, which was the most intense phase of the bombing. And you see the destruction is almost equal to that of Aleppo over 3 years. This is some history experts trying to compare it to other conflicts, so similar to the last slide. I just want to point out this, not everybody agrees with this, but so in just over 2 months, researchers say the offensive has wreaked more destruction than, said proportionally, the Allied bombing of Germany in World War II. That is incredible. There's arguments about this. You are definitely going to find somebody say, oh, give me a break, it's not even close. But we don't have to decide that. There are historians talking about it as being as destructive as the Allied bombing of Germany, which is unprecedented, to say the least. Okay, last thing I'm going to say on the bombing campaign. So this is from Plus 972. If you don't know of that publication, I'll just recommend it to you. It's Israeli and Palestinian journalists. It's really excellent work. Plus 972 is the area code in all of Israel, I think, or Jerusalem, I don't remember. So they were able to talk to people off the record, and there's sort of 2 things to say. One is they have been using an AI system, an artificial intelligence system, to identify targets. And this has meant a ton of targets, which is how you're able to get that sort of destruction in that short of time. You also need the weapons, of course. But you need something that looks like you did some work to find a target that's legitimate. They used AI to do that. It has spit out more targets than they could possibly imagine. I don't think any objective observer thinks that these targets are really that well thought out, or that the principles of distinction, meaning making a distinction between civilians and militants, is part of international law, and proportionality, meaning is the value of the target and the collateral damage, is there proportion being made between the value of the military target and the collateral damage? And in the article, it also says that the sort of criteria went from a dozen or so civilian casualties on a strike to hundreds as allowed on strikes. It said for senior Hamas officials. But they also said most of those people are underground, so now they're targeting junior Hamas officials, whatever that means exactly. Nobody really knows. So they have greatly changed their criteria for when and how and what collateral damage they're willing to accept. And that's how you get these kinds of numbers. Okay. Because Rafah has become an important conversation, it's still right now an important part of the conversation. And in here you're going to see a map, and it'll show you where Rafah is. It's a city in southern Gaza. It's where millions of Palestinians are now sheltering. And Israel wants to go into Rafah. The international community is thankfully starting to push back pretty significantly. But I just want you to see this from Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is a Qatari news network. I find it really helpful to go to sources like Al Jazeera, because you're getting a totally different perspective. You're getting the Arab world's perspective on what's happening. So this will give you the ins and outs of the Rafah issue.
All eyes are on Rafah, Gaza's southernmost city. Why? Israel says a ground operation there is necessary to defeat Hamas, the stated aim of Israel's war. That spread panic and fear among Palestinians. But why did it prompt warnings of slaughter and carnage with untold consequences? Rafah is a governorate in the very south of the Gaza Strip, along the Egyptian border. Before the war, it was home to 260,000 people. Now, the population is more than 5 times that, at around 1.5 million people. For comparison, Rafah is about the same size of the tiny landlocked European country of San Marino, but with more than 40 times its population. So how did we get here? Back in October, Israel ordered people in Gaza to move south of this line as Israeli troops invaded. Then, the Israeli army expanded its ground operation to Khan Yunis, attacking where they had previously indicated as safe. So people fled further south to Rafah, as Israeli forces said that was now the new safe area. Then, with 2/3 of Gaza's entire population crammed in, Israel intensified its bombing on Rafah. According to Amnesty International, at least 95 civilians, nearly half of their children, have been killed in 4 major attacks there since December, which it says was investigated as war crimes. For those who aren't killed, the situation is described as a humanitarian nightmare, with aid agencies warning of famine. Now, Israel's prime minister promised safe passage, but every previous area Israel said was safe hasn't been, either from bombs or sniper fire, despite people waving white flags. And even if safe passage was guaranteed, where can people go? North of Rafah, there is the Al-Nawazi camp, a 6.5 square kilometer patch of desolate coastal land, an area which has also been hit by Israeli strikes. Tens of thousands of people are already sheltering there without supplies or infrastructure. People in Rafah can't flee in the west through Egypt's sealed and fortified border, or south, where Israelis have been blocking the entry of aid through the Karem Abu Salem crossing. Fighting hasn't stopped in central Gaza either, and northern Gaza is 80% rubble. The European Union foreign policy chief sums it up.
They are going to evacuate. Where? To the moon? Where are they going to evacuate these people?
What he says echoes what Palestinians and human rights groups have been saying for months, that nowhere is safe in Gaza, and no evacuation plan from Rafah can change that.
So I would say stay tuned on Rafah. We are right now, like over the last week or two, the rhetoric from the United States and increasingly from significant individuals within our government has been shifting, thankfully. It took way too long, and we'll get to that. But it's shifting, and there's been a lot of pressure put on Israel to not do this. I think there's reason to hope that it won't happen. But if it does, that is going to be a huge turning point in all of this, because it's going to happen really against the wishes of almost the entire international community at this point. Questions? Please.
Is this reaction from Israel exactly what Hamas expected and wanted? Mm-hmm. And if so, why would the Gazans elect them knowing that this was a possibility?
Yeah. So the election was 2006. That's the last time they had an election. And so that's coming off of the second Intifada. So we don't, I mean, in terms of knowing well what Gazans or Palestinians at large, right, so let's say in the West Bank and Gaza, what their views of Hamas are, at this point, there's some polling, but I don't think it's fair to look at the 2006 election and think that that level of support is also the level of support today. And I think probably after October the 7th, which I don't need to sugarcoat anything, there were definitely lots of Palestinians who were pleased to see their oppressors suffer. There's just no doubt about that. That's not pretty. I don't like that that's the case, but we have to live in reality. There were some. I think after this high price, views on Hamas are going to be pretty conflicted. And that's what we see in the polling. Sometimes you see 30% support, sometimes actually a little bit more in the West Bank, which kind of makes sense. They're not suffering as bad as Gaza. I don't think you can look at, I think you should look at Hamas and think about rationality, which is kind of what you're asking, right? Like, what's the rationality here? I think you also have to realize this is an extremist religious group. And an extremist religious group of any religion have rationality, but it's not the rationality that most of us have, let's say. And that also goes for Hamas. So I don't have a lot of good things to say about Hamas, except they're willing to die and sacrifice the lives of others for their cause. And there have been other causes in which people have done this, and we've seen it as noble. I don't see it this way in this, but there are some within Palestinian society who do see it that way. They want freedom. You know, freedom isn't free. We say that here all the time, right? So I don't know. I am genuinely conflicted, not conflicted on how I view what they've done and sort of what they stand for, but conflicted because they are a part of Palestinian society, and to pretend like we can solve this problem and ignore Hamas is false. It cannot, it won't work. Oh, please.
Yeah, an irony is that I had a visit with Bill Heisinger's office on, I think, October 5th or 6th, and I was talking about the Betty McCollum bill, which conditioned U.S. aid to Israel based on the adherence to human rights with respect to the torture and imprisonment of children under the age of 21. And his staff person, an ice hockey player from Albion College, said, we have to really protect the safety of Israel. And then October 7th happened, and I thought, well, I bet he thought he said something really important. I'm not from Holland, Michigan, but I was educated here, and I just want to know what information is getting to your elected officials, or official here, and also how important is U.S. support for continuing this carnage, and does the United States have a set of brakes that they can use? Because I wasn't feeling that Heisinger's office had much of a point of view other than Israel right or wrong.
That's correct. Yeah. I'm going to say just a little bit, and then I want to come back to it, because we're going to show a video of Chris Van Hollen, senator from Maryland, speaking on this issue that I think it might be better to talk about U.S. politics there, if that's all right. So what would I say about it now? We're still in an environment, especially if you're a Republican elected official, where there's no political benefit to doing anything but supporting Israel. In the Republican Party, there's no disagreement on this issue currently. That could change. Historically, it has been different. James Baker was, what was he? Secretary of State?
Yeah, Bush the first.
For Bush the First, he was one of the toughest Secretary of States on Israel we've had. Pretty fair. So it's not that historically Republicans aren't willing to play hardball with Israel. They are, but not currently. Within the Democratic Party, this is shifting, and it's shifting, I think, dramatically and quickly. Certainly within the Democratic electorate. It's not fully represented in the Democratic elected officials. It's more so in the House, not surprisingly, because you get more turnover there. You get actually some people who are under the age of 40 or 50 or even 60 in the House. So when you see, when the first groups of people calling for a ceasefire, they were Democratic members of the House. They were all either women or people of color. Noteworthy, I think. So the Democratic Party is sort of the only party that's looking at this in a nuanced way. And even there, it's not great, but improving every day. We want to tell just a couple stories from our trip, and then
Maybe one.
we're going to tell one story from our trip. That's Hebron?
Yeah,
I think it has to be Hebron, because that's the most interesting one. Skip this, skip that. Can I show them this? No? I'd answered it myself. Okay. Just want to show you quickly where Hebron is and say a little bit about it. Truly just a little bit. You could have a whole hour session on Hebron easily. Hebron's in the West Bank, southern West Bank, so right there. Everybody see that? It's small there, sorry. And this is another map of Hebron, which you would need a long time to understand. I'm going to give you some basics on it. Within Hebron, there's this big settlement over here called Kiryat Arba, but that is outside of the sort of central part of the city. Within the city itself, in what is now called H2, referred to as H2, there is a small amount of settlers who live there, in the heart of the city of Hebron. And I mean in the heart, like the very downtown area. They've stolen homes from Palestinians, they've just found their way to get various places within Hebron. And there's only about 800 Israeli civilians living in Hebron. Again, that's what a settler is, an Israeli civilian, Jewish Israeli civilian, I should say. And within H2, so within H1, there's like 200,000 Palestinians living there, roughly. Within H2, this other big area, there's 35,000 Palestinians, but they are living in a highly controlled area, controlled by the Israeli military. There's checkpoints all over H2. There are parts of H2 that are totally closed off to anybody but Israeli settlers. There's the troop presence, the amount of Israeli troops there is exceedingly high for 800 to protect. That's what they would say they're doing, protecting these 800 Israeli settlers. And we went there and had a Palestinian show us around and talk to us about Hebron. Chris is going to talk about this guy.
This is Isa, born, raised, lives in Hebron, lives in that H2 area, and so every day has to navigate checkpoints. His life is severely restricted along with anyone who lives in there. He's a nonviolent activist. He's been at this for a long, long time, has suffered a great deal physically, I'm sure materially. On October 7th, he was taken into custody, in his words, tortured for a number of hours, and this is not the first time. There's just constant harassment for him and for those who live in this particular part of Hebron.
Yeah, and I'll just say something relative. I'm not going to do that, never mind. We're going to get to the video. Okay, so we were there, and as we finished our tour with Isa, as we were finishing, we encountered this group of people, and it was a bunch of Israeli soldiers and a group of maybe 50, let's say, Israeli settlers. And they were in this closed-off city. We were also allowed to be there, as was Isa, so it was in H2, but not a part of H2 that is only allowed for Israeli settlers. But they were being protected by the settlers, by the soldiers, and we kind of just walked by them and went on our way, and I didn't really know what they were doing there or what was about to happen. And it turned out it was Saturday, so it was the Jewish Sabbath. And then we got sort of to the marketplace, and then I'm going to play this video for you. What you're going to see is Israeli soldiers, I think will be pretty obvious to you. And they're going to be encircling this group of Jewish Israeli settlers who live in the heart of Hebron.
Josh, can you explain what a settler is?
I can.
Explain what a settler is.
Okay, just again, a settler is a Jewish Israeli civilian living in occupied territory illegally. Settlements are illegal under international law, the Fourth Geneva Convention. I took this video. It's not great. Ran into the guy's gun right there. Whoops.
שבת שלום לכולם, הסיור שלנו מסתיים, ונגיד תודה.
Yeah, what a bizarre experience. I've been to Palestine and Israel a number of times now. I've never experienced anything as strange as this. It's often Hebron's talked about as a microcosm of the conflict. Everything's so up close and rubbing shoulders with one another. And so here we are on the thoroughfare of the Palestinian market, and up comes strolling this group. Everyone smiling, protected by this 20, 25 soldiers. It's just very bizarre that all of this is the way that we've decided to do things. It's bizarre.
And you may have heard, just real quickly, you may have heard of Shabbat Shalom. I don't know if you caught that.
Yeah.
But I mean, just to add to the absurdity,
Yeah.
that this person, what they were doing is they were doing this special blessing at the end of Sabbath, and they wanted to do it in this place, and so the soldiers will facilitate that for them. So he's doing a blessing for the end of Sabbath amongst all these soldiers in a part of Hebron that is really Palestine. You get it, right? Odd. Shabbat Shalom is like peaceful Sabbath.
Yeah.
I almost laughed when he said it.
Yeah.
But there was enough fear in me about being surrounded by soldiers and that I didn't. There was some defiance in me. I wanted to, like, are you serious? You're gonna say Shabbat Shalom right now. But I didn't, which I think for me was an experience of like, what is it like to suppress your sense of justice, to constantly have to suppress when you're being put under these terrible conditions. It's a lot to ask of a group of people, and it's been happening for, let's say, if we started at 67 when the occupation began, right, we're over 50-some years. That's hard to do.
Super hard. So I'm just looking at the time here. You know, these pictures of the soldiers are maybe worth just noting, and maybe we kind of draw to a close or close to it here. Look at these young people. I have a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old. Standing a foot away from this person, I couldn't help but think, what if I was an Israeli? I happened to have been born in this part of the world. I happen to have children. Would these be my children? And so amidst all the disorienting bewilderment and the anger and the angst that we were all feeling, there was also this moment of humanity, and that was all in the mix there too. Again, it was just a bizarre experience. Yeah.
Yes.
And there, at the previous slide, showed women soldiers as well.
That's right. It's 2 years for women, mandatory service, 3 years for men. Yeah. One thing within Israel that is controversial right now and has been for a long time is that the ultra-Orthodox do not have to serve. They get exemption from service, and increasingly the rest of Israeli society is getting very frustrated with that. But that's a side issue. I want to play one more slide because it gets at the current American posture, changing posture towards Israel. So this is going to be, and then we'll end, because I know we're coming up against time. So this is Chris Van Hollen. He's a Democrat from Maryland, senator. I don't know him. I mean, who's ever heard of Chris Van Hollen?
Okay, yeah, a couple of
Right. This isn't a guy who's out there like a firebrand liberal guy on every issue. He's a pretty middle-of-the-road Democrat from what I know of him. So he is on here he's on, I think it's Face the Nation. I don't know which one CBS has. I think that might be right. It's being interviewed by Margaret Brennan. He does mention in here David Satterfield. He's going to say Satterfield said, David Satterfield is the special envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues. Just to give you that, who he's going to reference. I think what's happening right now in the U.S. government in relation to Israel is, I think it could be termed seismic. You had Chuck Schumer come out and call for Netanyahu to be removed. I mean, we can't say removed, we don't do that type of thing, but that his time as the leader should end because he's doing a poor job for his own people in Chuck Schumer. And Chuck Schumer is Jewish. He's within the Democratic Party. There's probably no bigger supporter of the state of Israel than Chuck Schumer, and we're already getting him out in front on this issue. And then here, Chris Van Hollen. I also saw last night that the U.S. is crafting a Security Council resolution that calls for a ceasefire. We have at least once, maybe twice, vetoed, thank you, vetoed that. It's the only reason a ceasefire has not happened, is because of the U.S. And thankfully that's changing. But I just want you to hear the way he talks about Netanyahu. He's pretty careful. You can see him selecting every word. But still, this type of language being used by a sitting U.S. senator about the state of Israel is pretty remarkable.
Some Republicans want to cut off support for the UN agency, UNRWA, that supports about 6 million Palestinian refugees, Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza Strip, West Bank. You said last week, senators need to read the classified report prepared by the Director of National Intelligence about the Netanyahu government claims about that agency. You seem to be implying that the links to terror groups are unfounded.
Oh, there's no doubt that the claim that Prime Minister Netanyahu and others are making that somehow UNRWA is a proxy for Hamas are just flat out lies. That's a flat out lie. If you look at the person who's in charge of operations on the ground in Gaza for UNRWA, it's about a 20-year US Army veteran. Mm-hmm. You can be sure he is not in cahoots with Hamas. Netanyahu has wanted to get rid of UNRWA since at least 2017. That's been his goal, not just in Gaza, but also in the other places you talked about. And if you get rid of UNRWA in Gaza today, it is the primary distribution system for food and aid. So if you cut off funding for UNRWA in Gaza entirely, it means more people will starve, more people won't get the medical assistance they need, and so it would be a huge mistake to cut them off.
Can you explain why you believe that the Prime Minister is trying to dismantle UNRWA, which is the agency that has 13,000 people distributing aid? No one else has that kind of infrastructure in Gaza.
Well, that's exactly right. And there have been allegations made by the Netanyahu government that up to 14 of those 13,000 people were involved in the horrific October 7th attacks. We should investigate it. We should hold all those people accountable. But for goodness sakes, let's not hold 2 million innocent Palestinian civilians who are dying of starvation. Let's not hold them essentially accountable for the bad acts of 14 people.
Back in February, you pushed the Biden administration to craft what ended up being a national security memorandum that requires countries who receive U.S. weapons, all countries, to certify that they are in compliance with U.S. law and they are not blocking the delivery of humanitarian aid. Israel has until March 24th to turn in a letter. They reportedly did so. Are they in compliance?
No, they're not as of today. And you're right, this is a very important tool that the Biden administration's put forward. It applies to Israel and any other country that receives U.S. military assistance. I mean, the Netanyahu government can open their Red's Crossing to help starving people in northern Gaza. They can stop turning away maternity kits, claiming that somehow they pose a dual-use danger, that they could be used for military purposes. They can stop turning away water purifiers, because when they do that, they send a whole truck back for 4 weeks. So they need to allow more assistance in, and they need to really deal with that deconfliction issue. People need to be able to deliver assistance without getting killed. So I do want to point out also, Margaret, that Ambassador Satterfield has said very clearly that when it comes to UN provided humanitarian assistance, like humanitarian assistance through UNRWA, there's been no evidence of diversion to Hamas. And then, so he said this very, very clearly.
And all of Congress has received that information?
I have tried to tell my colleagues who keep coming back from meeting with Netanyahu government officials, spreading this lie, this myth about diversion from UNRWA. Now, there may be diversion in other places, but not from UNRWA.
And there is currently a bill being crafted which would cut off aid to UNRWA. So there's good news and bad news. And we gotta end. I'm sorry, we're way up against time. Thank you so much.